Hey, Michael.
Hey, Istvan.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Cool. I'm fine. You have a nicer background than I do. I have an artificial one.
Yeah, I gather that much, but at least you're advertising your university.
Yeah, well, let's make it look more official because actually it is. I'm using people like you for my course, and so actually it fits very well. But your background looks very nice, very woody, and
Yeah, I'm inside an art studio of sorts. So hence all the stuff on the walls.
Cool, excellent. So we could, I guess, start. So this week's topic in my class is the extended mind hypothesis, extended cognition more generally. And I will ask you a few questions about this, especially that you are one of the people really involved in this research agenda right now. And you have a book that came out just last year,
Right.
which is what you call a third wave of extended cognition. So I want to start with the very basic idea, and so where it all started, the 1998 paper by Chalmers and Clark, and maybe a bit of prehistory to that paper. They do mention quite a few authors who already formulated the thesis in some way or other.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess Clark and Chalmers in their 1998 analysis paper sort of made that thesis of the extended mind quite popular, if you like. But there's a few historical precursors to that particular paper, and I think one important precursor is the work by Ed Hutchins, who's a cognitive anthropologist at UC San Diego, and there's a sense in which some of Hutchinson's work actually merges quite nicely and integrates really nicely with third wave thinking about the extended mind. So the first sort of premise, and that's debatable, is that Hutchins effectively takes what you might call a wide computational stance or an extended computational stance across a set of individuals, across a set of media, across a set of technologies, etc., in order to understand how, for instance, a group of individuals can navigate a military fleet or ship into harbor. And one of the things that he notes there is effectively what he does is he says, we can't just understand how that's the case by looking at the performance of a singular individual. Rather, what you want to do is you want to say something like an individual is embedded within a larger set of practices, which in part impacts on the performance of that particular individual. So once you've got that, you've got a kind of an extended system that processes information in a particular way. And once you understand the ways in which that system processes information, you get an account of how a group of individuals is able to do a particular task, such as navigating a ship into harbor, for instance. So that's the kind of first sort of, I think, 1995, the book Cognition in the Wild, that sort of sets the scene, I think, in the background for the 1998 paper. There's a different but similar paper also from 1995 by Rob Wilson on wide computationalism, which effectively just takes the input process output model of computationalism and applies it to an extended system. So you get a notion of wide computation, which is not totally dissimilar to the kind of argument that you see pursued by Clark and Chalmers in that The Extended Mind paper in analysis.
Yes, well, especially the wide computationalism paper had quite some impact, the Rob Wilson paper. But it was somehow, well, as it happens, it was really after the Clark-Chalmers paper that we had the heading, and we could call this thesis a kind of very catchy way. So I want to ask you, I think the core, what people remember from the paper, as it happens, is the auto thought experiment and criterion that they use. For establishing whether we could talk about a case of extended mind. So if you could tell us what the criterion was in that paper.
Yeah, of course. I mean, just stepping back a little bit, what's nice about the paper, and I think that's why it made an impact, and then I'll get to that criterion, is I think they segue from thinking about cognition to thinking about mind. Right? So they get into the sort of nitty-gritty, if you like, a philosophy of mind, talking about the constitution of a belief. and in particular, not so much the content of that belief, although that carries across in the Otto case, but most importantly, the vehicles that underwrites the content. So what we have and what the sort of marshal is a kind of heuristic. It's meant to sort of lead us out or away from so-called, as they say in that article, sort of bio-chauvinistic tendencies, if you like. So our natural inclinations to think that we should be internalists about the mind in either a kind of metaphysical way or a methodological way. And they do that by appealing to this, what's become known as the so-called parity principle in the literature. And the parity principle works more or less, this is the exact quote, and then we can kind of unpack it. So they say, if as we confront some task, part of the world functions as a process which were to go on in the head, we would have no hesitation in accepting that as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is for that time part of the cognitive process. And that's applied as you make reference to in the Otto example. So the way it works there is we've got two characters, just to unpack that, Otto and Inga. In the Inga case, and they both kind of want to do the same thing. They want to go see some exhibition at some museum, the Modern Museum of Art in New York. And Inga, hears about it, consults her neurobiologically realized memory traces of the location of the museum. And on the basis of that, she forms the belief that it's on 53rd Street, and then she heads off and voila, she ends up going to the museum. So what happens there is we identify a belief about the location of something, and then we associate that belief with having a particular function of driving behavior in a particular way. And typically we would say once we've identified that particular function, it drives behavior in a particular way, then we're happy to, if you like, label it a cognitive process or a mental state. In the Otto case, that works in the following way. So Otto also hears about it. He wants to go, but he's got Alzheimer's, as we know. So he has, he's this habit of writing down things in his notebook, and he looks it up. He finds the particular page, and there it is. MoMA is located on 53rd Street. And on the basis of that information, he goes to enjoy that particular exhibition. So here's the analogy. We're happy to associate the function, in the case of Inga, as having a cognitive role in her mental life and her behavioral life. In the case of Otto, it seems like the inscriptions in the notebook have exactly the same function. So independent of where we locate the particular function, whether inside the head or partly outside the head, insofar as you are a functionist, which Clark and Chalmers are, and that's the kind of underlying metaphysical view of the mind that you get in this particular paper, then you should, all things being equal, be happy to grant that the inscriptions in Otto's notebook is also part and parcel of Otto's mind, similarly to Inga.
Yeah, excellent. So there's, of course, plenty of questions, and this grew after this paper. The literature exploded, and we had literally hundreds of views about this. One view that let's say, type of criticism that it was very influential was Robert Rupert's criticism that this is not actually not a good model for the real biological memory that we have. So if you could tell us something about, do you think this is do you think this is a kind of relevant criticism given what Clark and Chalmers' agenda was at the time? And should we care about this more now, or now that we, like everyone more or less admits that cognition is embodied, extended, and so on?
Well, I wouldn't want to say everybody thinks that's the case, but we can certainly step back. And so the way I sort of read Rupert is he effectively develops what you might call a methodological argument for a kind of view you might term embedded cognition, which is supposed to be a weaker stance or a weaker thesis than the extended mind. Right? So, and the rough idea here is that you want to, on the one hand, you want to have a view of the integration of mechanisms involved in sort of particular cognitive processes to be particularly strong, right? Such that once from a psychological or a cognitive science perspective, you start studying those mechanisms underwriting, say, episodic memory, then it tends to be across a sample of individuals, roughly the same type of mechanisms that you're interested in. And interestingly enough, of course, it tends to be the individual that carries around these particular mechanisms that has this particular strong degree of integration. Hence, we shouldn't, right, include external elements like notebooks, iPhones, iPads, whatever, as part and parcel of explanations, because that makes our explanations too sort of fleety and ephemeral, effectively. It breaks with that important intuition that we want to have roughly the same kind of mechanisms in our explanations when we look for those types of mechanisms. And it seems like the extended mind position gives up in part on that sort of underlying assumption. There's a second aspect to Rupert's argument, but we can unpack that as we go along. But that's, of course, this idea that biological memory and memory in the case of Otto, or the functional profile of biological mechanisms and the functional profile of artifacts and technologies seem, once you get into the sort of finer details of it, to be quite dissimilar. And given that the Clark and Chalmers paper runs on a kind of functional similarity between internal states and external states, as long as they carry or have the same or perform the same functional role in generating behavior, then Rupert's critique on the one hand suggests that our cognitive science becomes too messy if you go down the extended mind route. And on the other hand, that actually you cannot defend the functional similarity position on the basis of looking at the finer grains or the details of our explanations. Yeah, so I do think that actually has an important role to play. It's also a view that's sort of coming up in other debates that I'm interested in at the moment, where you ask sort of questions about where you draw the boundaries of mind. And one line of argument here is actually those should be drawn around the central nervous system, because it's those kind of states that we are interested in as cognitive sciences, because it's those kind of states that perform a particularly important role in, for instance, maintaining the integrity of the organism.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, I was thinking right now that, we would formulate the thesis in various ways with various strengths. And I think, the weakest one maybe, and maybe it's trivial, and it would be trivial and it wouldn't really be the extended mind thesis, would be that, well, we make use of stuff in the environment. We are tool users, etc. And of course, just like other animals, they are tool users. Some animals, some apes are even tool builders. But, no one should, let's say, make a big fuss about this. Like, okay, still the cognitive system is here. And, it's like, we learn to deal with the environment in creative ways. This is a kind of weak way. The second step would be to say, well, and I think that's Chalmers Clark, it's like we could think sometimes of ways in which we use the environment as actually being equivalent to the environment becoming part of our cognitive system. So contrary to what we would think, it's not all here, but actually some parts of the environment could work like that. Then a stronger thesis would be that, it would be based on the second, or the one that I just formulated, plus the idea that in these cases, and this would be stronger than Chalmers Clark, in these cases, you cannot decouple the brain from that part of the environment. And this will bring us to the second wave, but I don't want to get into that right now. A fourth one, even stronger, would be that, and I think this is then Hato Mayan kind of way, right? Which would say that, well, it's not that we can extend the mind. It is extended all the time.
That's right.
And it's more like the embedded cognition, I think, although it could be made more stronger than that. So I think all these ways of formulating it ultimately will, which one you choose will depend on something that you have been writing a lot about, which is the causation versus the constitution issue. So right. Everyone agrees that there's a causal coupling of some sort, and that it is kind of, strong enough and stable and so on. But people who are more metaphysically minded, they say, well, why do we infer from something like a causal coupling, a causal mechanism, anything stronger than mere causation, which happens all the time, and it's nothing, no big deal.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. So maybe we can just sort of segue through the 4 options and note and make some comments on those, and you can remind me if I lose track of what they were. You can bring me up on them again. Yeah. I take it the first sort of move is just then we're all Cartesian in a sense, right? So I take it even Descartes, who would be an excellent example of an internalist, would of course allow for the fact that in order for us to have information, etc., about the world, in order for us to function, etc., we need to stand in some sort of causal dependence with our bodies and the rest of our social cultural environments or our material culture, etc. So that's the kind of view that anybody that would be a metaphysical internalist would be happy to subscribe to. Right? So that's just metaphysical internalism, I take it. But we still want to locate what the constitutive mechanisms of cognition. We will locate those inside the individual. Clark-Chalmers' view, and I think this is important, is of course only a kind of partial view. It's not a blanket type view. So Mark Rowlands has a nice paper setting that out in the 2009 paper in Topoi. So it's important to note it's only like, from time to time, or when you're in the right kind of circumstances, always hedged in that particular way, that, there may be an external element or an external process that performs a functionally similar role to something that we would normally take to be cognitive or part of the individual. So it's certainly not the case that it's all time. Even I take it, Rupert would allow for a case like that. So I'm thinking here, for instance, like an ear implant or a hearing aid. As long as you have a sufficient degree of integration, then you have a sufficiently integrated cognitive system that you can think of as part biological and part artificial or technological. So all that hinges on the integration of the elements in question into a particular system, hence the notion of an integrated system. The third option, the second wave option, is closer to the fourth option, namely the kind of an activist line, than it is to the Clark and Chalmers. So if you take, for instance, the stance of cognitive integrationism, which is the position defended by Richard Menari, that also starts for this premise that it's not like the mind somehow extends outside the individual, such that you assume internalism from the start, and then you figure out from time to time which external element can play the role of cognitive process to defend the extended mind. It's much rather that it's the biological individual that stand in a particular relationship to an external element that jointly comprises the system that realizes a cognitive process. So in the case of Otto remembering, it's not that Otto is cognitive and then we find an element and that element becomes cognitive. It's rather the mutual relationship between Otto and the notebook, the way Otto influences the notebook, which in part influences what Otto does, that jointly constitute the process of remembering where MoMA is located. So there's a sense in which it's a jointly constituted process from the start. Now, that gets strengthened or in some part by both the kind of autopoietic and active line, which you can associate with people like Ezequiel de Paulo, but also in the work of radical and activism, as you mentioned, by Hotto and Mian. And there the idea is that first and foremost, cognition is wide or extensive, as they like to say. And only secondarily do you come to have a kind of view, for instance, of imagination and dreaming as a kind of an offline inaction of things you would have acquired through ongoing coupling and relations to the environment. So here we start out with an extensive position, which is not the same as the Clark and Chalmers view. So that kind of view is actually off the table if you're a radical and activist. I think another thing to say about some of the moves from the first wave, which we associate with Clark and Chalmers, and then into the third wave, but also the inactive line, is what you have there is a lot more emphasis on the temporal dimension and the dynamics as such, rather than a focus on location. So De Paulo in the 2009 paper, which is called Extended Life, sort of comes out and says about the Clark-Chalmers view, this is all about location, location, location. So there's a kind of spatial dimension that's explored in that particular angle. So we're focusing on the location of elements. what we should be focusing on is the functional profile of some of these elements, and then their temporal duration, over which timescales do they occur, and how are they integrated with other processes, and what are the timescales of those particular processes. Okay, I think the other bit you said was a kind of common criticism about the causal constitutive relation.
Yeah, and I mentioned this because actually it connects very well with your work on this dynamic, not this kind of simultaneous constitution, but constitution over time, because I think that's what you need ultimately for really understanding the thesis in this more radical way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the first way to sort of start stepping back and thinking a little bit about this is, of course, so what's happening here is that we do extended mind, and then we borrow a set of vocabulary that comes out of analytic metaphysics. So you'll sometimes read people say, the mind supervenes on underlying physical states, where some of those physical states can include external elements in the world, or certain mental states are constituted or partly constituted by, or certain mental states are composed by, or certain mental states are realized by. That's the kind of realizer functionalism that you see in combination with multi-realizability in the first wave scenario. But of course, if you consult the metaphysical literature, you'll quite often or quite quickly come to see what they have in mind there. They don't have anything like a temporal view of these metaphysical dependence relations in mind. So it's much rather the view that you would find from somebody like Jae-Kwon Kim. So at an instant T, some higher order mental state supervenes on a lower level physical state or lower level physical property, similarly with the Constitution claim. The problem for that view is that once you plug that into a kind of empirically oriented philosophy of cognitive science, where you want to understand processes, and processes are inherently temporal, and what realizes those processes are inherently temporal, then you have to give up on this sort of snapshot view that something can be constituted at an instant T. That's the sort of first point of my interest in this particular debate. The second part is actually to try to get clearer about what causation versus constitution actually means. So typically you want to associate a causal relationship with a notion like temporality, because, the cause precedes the effect, so to speak. So you get a kind of inherent view of causation as temporal in some kind of Humean notion, if you like, of causation at least. Contrast that with the constitutive view, which is paradigmatically not temporal. So you get this delineation between causation on the one hand and constitution on the other hand. Once we start then getting into thinking about some of these examples, that's not so clear that how some of those examples actually work. So the way I'm thinking about this here in terms of, you can take Hutchins as a nice example. So you've got a multiplicity of different individuals that do different things. Those individuals are then embedded within a set of cultural practices that in part with norms, etc., that partly constrains how those individuals go about doing their assigned roles. So one way now to set this up is to think, actually individuals collaborating with each other is embedded within larger social cultural networks. And those social cultural networks partly constrain the operations of the individuals, and the individuals partly constitute those social cultural networks. One way you can get into casting the difference between what happens at the level of the ensembles or the collective and what happens at the scale of the individual actually follows from differences in time scale. So me being able to do something is going to go a lot quicker than our collective project, such that the collective project can be seen as constraining my performance, in part because the collective project unfolds over a longer period of time. And that's a quite nice view, because that gains some traction through something like a slaving principle in statistical physics, or once you get into dynamical systems theory, you'll see it again typically exemplified by examples like, convection rules, etc. What you have there is you have fast timescales and you have slower moving timescales. And the slower moving timescales in part constrains the operations of the faster moving timescales, or things that happen over faster timescales. Now that's an empirical nicety in the sense that works wonderful with how neuronal synergies in our central nervous system are established, where neuronal dynamics unfolding over larger timescale enslave dynamics unfolding over faster timescales, and so on and so forth. And you find it in all kinds of examples. What's happening here is you've got a kind of reciprocal loop as well between the constituents and the constituted. The constituents operate over their own timescale, constituted operates over its timescale. But what it really is, if you start working on the properties of these examples, it's really a form of reciprocal causation. So some of the work I've been doing also with Julian Kieverstein in this book from last year is to draw a distinction here between linear and nonlinear forms of causality, or between linear and reciprocal notions of causality. And one of the proposals that we have is actually, when it comes to thinking about work in the extended mind tradition, that's a lot more like reciprocal notions of causation rather than linear notions of causation. And we can start associating those particular notions of causation with a form of diachronic constitution. That's the proposal. Now, once you do all that, then you don't have that problem. So if you step back and start thinking about the causal constitutive fallacy, the objection to the extended mind, that of course turns, as you said, on this sort of initial assumption that it's a fallacy to infer facts about causation, or facts about constitution, from facts about causation. Right? So that's the setup. And since the extended mind, even in the Clark and Chalmers paper, before they move into the functionalist argument for the extended mind, turns on this idea of a two-way causal pathway between individuals and the environment, it seems inevitable that they're going to make that particular mistake, right? The so-called causal constitution fallacy. But if you cannot draw a hard delineation between causation and constitution, then that particular move is off the table. So that's one way of trying to argue against the sort of standard take on the causal constitutive fallacy. Yeah,
very good. So, I mean, I agree. I actually read all your papers on this topic. In a way, it is, in a way you say, okay, these people, metaphysicians, they talk about something. Philosophers of mind talk about something else, but it was important to actually make it clear that we should not simply copy and take the notion from metaphysics, the classical standard constitution notion, and apply it here. But so let me move to this. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to comment. I mean, I don't want it to come across as if that notion, that sort of a synchronous notion of constitution, doesn't have any role to play. I do think it has a role to play, but then I think it depends on. That can depend on our interest of explanation. So one of the sort of standard examples, of course, Michelangelo's David and the marble that constitutes Michelangelo's David. And one thing I've done in my work is to try, okay, so what are the properties in that particular constitutive relationship? And it's quite nice then to take a quite dynamical example and ask, okay, assume there's something like a constitutive relation involved here between the parts and the whole. What then are the properties of that particular constitutive relation? And interesting, if you have a quite, like say, an object-based example, like David and the piece of marble, and you have a dynamical example, like say the convection roll example, where you've got some molecule that constitute rolling behavior in say oil, etc., then you can kind of almost clearly show that there is no similarity in the properties shared across those particular examples. So it's not like you can get rid of the notion of synchronous constitution. It's more like it applies to particular cases. And it doesn't apply quite well when we shift into dynamical cases that we're interested in the philosophy of cognitive science or cognitive science in general.
Yeah, cool. So let me move to the second wave. And I personally found it a lot more interesting, the second wave, than the first wave. So if you could briefly explain what the second wave is, this complementarity principle in opposition to the parity principle. But I think John Sutton came up with this second wave, or he called it complementarity principle.
That's right. I mean, the way I sort of see the way I see, so having done my PhD with both Richard Menari and John Sutton as supervisors, I feel like I understand their position sort of at least reasonably well. And I take both of them as second wave theorists, and both of them emphasize quite different things, although there are similarities across their different positions. But you can start by saying, okay, first wave, functional similarity between the internal and the external. Right? So that's quite broad, but that's good enough to try to get into understanding what complementarity then means. The complementarity thesis advocated by John Sutton starts from the premise, actually, what we need to understand is the functional dissimilarities between internal mechanisms and the kind of properties that we associate or we see that external elements have, such as notebooks, computers, etc. And it's precisely because of the dissimilarity between the two that you get a complement of the biological to the cultural. And it's that kind of complementary relationship that you should be interested in if you are a cognitive scientist. So that's broadly speaking the view of the complementarity thesis. The integrationist thesis builds on that from Richard Menari. On the one hand, you do have an emphasis on dissimilarities and functional complementarity, but you also have this notion of transformation. So as you integrate with or manipulate cultural artifacts, the thesis is that part of your onboard biological machinery is transformed in that particular process, or you internalize some of the functions of cultural features as you are jointly coupled to them over developmental time. So that requires a kind of longer time span view when you start thinking about internalization in that particular way. That's roughly how I see the second wave. So the second wave then would be advocating effectively what Rupert's trying to say we shouldn't be advocating, this total kind of distributed view of cognition where the realizers of cognitive systems can have any kinds of properties. There are no real fixed properties that we need to assume from the start. So the question now is, how do you then do cognitive science under such a particular lens? And a lot of Sutton's work, both on memory and in the case of, say, theater systems or theater companies, etc., has been trying to spell out how that actually works.
Yeah, very good example. I just gave that example last week in my class, the Globe Theater example, how they were able to memorize so much material using prompts from the environment. I want to put forward a kind of radical, stupid thought experiment, which will connect me to the third wave, I think, because it is something that someone could say. So you say, okay, let's suppose, we accept complementarity. And, it seems, and by the way, this idea of complementarity, you can even think of, the large evolutionary scale and find a similar idea on that scale. For example, in Skimstarani niche construction, his explanation of how human intelligence evolved. That's one example of complementarity over like the very long scale. And also Clarke's idea of, the natural born cyborg kind of thing. We are the kind of species that is fated to actually collaborate with the environment and even, replace slowly the natural with the artificial. So here is the idea. So why not in the future, actually, we just offload everything to the environment? Would that be possible? And while still being an agent, while still us being a cognitive agent, right? And I think one reason some people think this wouldn't be possible is that, well, we are conscious beings and consciousness cannot be extended. And I think Chalmers agreed with this at the time. Clarke was pushing this idea that maybe even consciousness could be extended. But then Chalmers said, okay, I don't think that's really possible. But I think in your book, in your latest view, and what you try to develop is basically that even, and this would be the third wave, right? That even this is possible. Or, if you could tell us something about this third wave thesis.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think let me just at least give you the sort of initial quote that sets it up, because what's kind of funny is that, the third wave is mentioned in the chapter by Sutton in an edited book that Minari published in 2010 called The Extended Mind. And there's only really a paragraph there. And sort of he's left it since then, right? You can sort of read some of his work through the third wave, but it's not something he's explicitly sort of devoted to elaborating on. At least that's my sense of it. But he just says in this 2010 paper, so he says, if there is to be a distinct third wave of the extended mind, it might be a deterritorialized cognitive science that deals with the propagation of deformed and reformatted representations, and which dissolves individuals into peculiar loci of coordination and coalescence among multiple structured media. Now, this is Hutchins coming through fully in as a proponent or as a voice for the third wave, but that's precisely how Hutchins articulates this. So a point of contrast to Clark would be, remember, so in the 2008 paper, and I'll come to consciousness eventually, if that's all right, there's this notion of organism-centered assembly of cognitive systems. And here you start by this idea that there's a canny cognizer that recruits external media depending on a particular task that's required for that particular individual to solve. So you take a kind of organism-centered view of what establishes the extended cognitive system. Third wave, I think, dissolves that kind of view. Here you embed the organism within a set of different cultural practices and dynamics that could include other organisms. So the network we're interested in here runs from neurobiology to morphology to, action receptors in the body, to interchanges with other individuals, to how those individuals are embedded within social cultural practices, and how those social cultural practices establish institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of network is what constrains jointly the establishment of particular cognitive processes or the resources required to perform particular cognitive processes. So more simply, some cognitive processes are partly assembled from our participation in cultural practices, and it's the cultural practices that does some of the action, if you like, in situated action. So that's the first the assembly of the individual, is that kind of unit of cognitive assembly. Then it goes on, this particular definition from Sutton's, without assuming distinct inner and outer realms of engrams and exograms, the natural and the artificial, each with its own characteristics. This third wave would analyze these boundaries as hard-won and fragile, developmental and cultural achievements, always open to renegotiation. Now, I have sort of some work on the first sort of issue, and more importantly, except for a few chapters in this book with Julian, we start working with this idea that our boundaries are always open for renegotiation. They're fragile and hard won, and they can shift over time, both developmentally, evolutionarily for the lineage, etc. Our defense, and just to speak to the point of the idea of extended consciousness, begins in sort of chapter 4. I have to say, a lot of the work in this book is premised on taking a particular framework that's sort of seeing some influence in computational neuroscience, and you could track down to theoretical biology. But I want to try to maybe leave that aside a little bit for this particular discussion. It's going to get us vastly sidetracked. Chalmers' argument, I think this is from a 2019 book chapter, is effectively that cycles of perception and action delineate between the conscious mind and what's outside the conscious mind. Right? So I can act on the world via my active states, and the world in part impacts on me via my sensory states. And that kind of delineates between what he thinks is possibly the case with consciousness and possibly not the case for consciousness, right? So there's a kind of perception-action divide between consciousness and non-consciousness, or between the parts of the mind that are conscious and the parts of the mind that are not conscious. So that's kind of an interesting setup. That seems to suggest that perception and action kind of places a rather rigid boundary between conscious experiences and what we're having experiences about, right? So what Julian and I would do in one chapter is we start marshalling an argument for why you can think about perceptive states and active states through the lens of the extended mind. So one little example is just, the spider and its relationship to its web. So you could say that you can delineate the spider, you can identify part of the boundary of the spider by associating that boundary with sensory and active states. Right? So it acts on the web, and there's vibrations in the web that then has some effects on its sensory receptors and so on and so forth. And we're not at this stage talking about consciousness, but if you want to think about consciousness, then in terms of the spider, that seems to be located on the internal side, whatever makes up that spider and whatever produces consciousness or conscious experiences or sentience, if you like, in the spider. But of course, one move immediately is to say, actually, the web itself functions as an extended sensory epithelia. So what you now have here is a set of sensory states that's wider than the biological system itself. There's the first attack on that particular perception-action boundary. We then develop a particular view in the context of Otto as well. So what we're saying here is part and parcel, or the notebook for Otto, and how Otto manipulates that particular notebook plays the kind of role that you would expect if Otto were an agent that expects him to consult the notebook over time and again and again and again. So it actually serves as a way for Otto to act on the world itself. So the notebook now becomes part and parcel of Otto's active states. That, again, analogy to the spider and the web, pushes the perception-action boundary out to include elements of our environment and not just elements of our biological system. So that kind of breaks with the initial attempt of Chalmers to use a kind of perception-action distinction to stop the move to extended consciousness. So one argument we make then is once you associate the notebook as being part of Otto's active states, then that actually is a realizer of the kind of sensory experiences that Otto expects to have given the kind of agent that Otto is. And the kind of agent that Otto is an extended agent or an extended phenotype. The notebook in question is a state of autophenotypic makeup. That's one line of argument we pursue in that particular book. Now, that's not to say that any kind of conscious experience is extended. Right? Otto can be dreaming, etc. But there's no hard boundary between where to draw that particular delineation or how to demarcate between what can and cannot play a role in realizing conscious experiences or constituting conscious experiences. So the move we defend or the line we defend is, there's certain occasions, this is the same as the first wave argument, right? It's a partial constitutive argument. When you're in the right circumstances and you've built up the right action routines with a particular set of artifacts in your surroundings, those particular artifacts can be part and parcel of the constitutive basis of your conscious experiences. Yeah,
thank you. So, yes, just to kind of to finish up, I wanted just, as you said, that you don't argue that all consciousness is extended. I think it's important to make it clear that the extended mind thesis as compared to, let's say, the more the great narrative type of things like the in activism, for example, does not claim that or typically doesn't claim that that it is a thesis about everything about the mind, right? So we still have a lot of mental life that's not like that. The thesis is rather that in what concerns, examples such as, online consciousness, interaction with the world, action, sensory motor loops, and so on. Here is something to think about, which makes sense, and so on. And of course, I don't think this is bad, because probably there's no theory that can, really claim that this is about the entire mind. As you mentioned, dreaming, and another example is the notion and the sense of self. So we do have, several notions of selves, and some of them are just involved in action in the world, but some of them are very self-reflective, and that doesn't seem to be, something that we should try to extend in any way, right?
I think I agree. I mean, I think the line we sort of take in the book is to say something like, so we adopt a kind of an active starting point. So we start from this extensive position. And then when we can go offline as well, but you have to run that developmentally and evolutionarily as well. And that's just to say that we recycle some of the dynamics that we build up over time in our continuous engagement with the world. So once you start thinking about dreaming, it is in a sense detached, but it's making use of some of the same dynamics that you will make use of in ongoing perceiving, ongoing engagement with your environment. I think it's also important to note, I mean, if we didn't do this in the book, but I'd love to do a second run on it. There's lots of interesting work now that suggests that even imagining or basic forms of perceiving is tied deeply into how our own bodies actually work, right? So there's intricate connections of neuronal activity between, say, the gut and our central nervous system. And a lot of this is now being explored on the lens that actually what sets us up for having affective experiences, for having dreams with affect, It's not like dreaming is just detached and cold. You wake up and you might be sweating because it's exciting and you feel scared. So there's a lot more going on here than it's just the kind of, you could be tempted to say, this is just to do with inside the head kind of things. But really, dreaming is probably a lot more to do with the dynamics of the internal operations across central and peripheral nervous systems. So that sort of lens, that then you get into sort of the game of thinking about embodied cognition. Then cognition is sort of intrinsically or inherently or constitutively embodied, rather than just kind of, let's say, to do with neural dynamics.
Yeah, excellent. So thanks a lot thanks to Michael Kirchhoff from the University of Wollongong for accepting my invitation to have this little 50-minute session on the extended mind. I'm sure that I think there's a lot of information in what we've been talking about, and I think students can ask a lot of questions after they watch this video. So thanks again for finding time. I hope everything is actually going well in Australia with respect to this virus stuff. I'm not sure. I don't hear a lot of things from there. But.
No, I mean, I think there's a couple of 100 deaths and coming up to about 1,000 people infected. But comparing to how it goes in certain other countries, it seems like things are not moving as fast down here. My sense is also I've been inside for 2 weeks, so I think people take it quite seriously. So things are I think are okay here with precautions and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot again. I hope to actually see you in physical space as well at some point if all this thing is over.
Yeah, that would be great. And just the final note: should there be any questions that the students would like to ask me, they can feel free to send me an email.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you.
All the best, and see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.